Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to have received this invitation and to have the chance to speak to you today. I look forward to the discussion with you during the question periods. I also want to add that you may pose your questions or your comments in French. I can understand enough French for that. I just don't, I feel embarrassed to speak it, academic French. And what I will try to do is to speak for about 15 minutes on one theme and then allow some discussion. And then I'll move on to the second theme for 15 minutes and then finally for the third theme. So just so you understand what's going to come, and you'll have many chances to engage with questions or comments. I'm very happy to be challenged on my interpretation of events as well. So to introduce what I'm going to do, I'll take you back to January 2011, as Giovanna just did. And it's clear that grassroots movements were able to mobilize and sustain protests and create an unexpected opening for political transition. And a very important factor in this was the acquiescence, if not the active collusion, of the armed forces in the ouster of the long-term president who they had previously served. And this, of course, reinforced hopes for a new era of democratic pluralist politics. 10 years later, as you just heard, the new authoritarian regime that rules Egypt is much fiercer than any of its predecessors, and especially fiercer than the regime of the former president Hosni Mubarak. So what I'm going to discuss today is three main themes. First is the political role of the armed forces. And here I will focus on governing arrangements, how Egypt is governed, but especially the relationship between the military and the president of the republic. Second, I will look at the military's economic interests and its relationship with the Egyptian private sector as a core indicator of the nature of Egypt's politics today. Third, I will touch a little bit on social transformations, which in my view are weakening the forces in society that normally would be expected to challenge the military and to seek democratic transition. So I'll touch then for the first part of my presentation today on the political role of the armed forces. And immediately there's a question, which is, how realistic was it ever to expect the armed forces to allow genuine political pluralism or to commit irrevocably to the peaceful transfer of power following routine elections or to obey civilian governments? This is a country in which the military had created the republic in 1952-53 and then remained one of the most important institutional powers in the country ever after. Why expect it to allow democratic transition, something that it had never sought or supported when it had the power and influence to do so previously? Now, if we look back to 2011, those exciting few weeks and months in the start of the year, there's evidence to suggest that the armed forces initially didn't know what to do. They were unsure of their own goals, what they wanted, and of the path they preferred for getting to their goals. I often suggest that the armed forces were like an orphan. Suddenly, Daddy Mubarak was gone, the father, and the orphan had to deal with real life, deal with social issues, with economic issues, with the currency, with investment, with foreign policy, all sorts of things that previously they had been protected from. And so, although the army may have assisted the departure of Mubarak, that doesn't necessarily mean that they had a clear idea of where they wanted to go next. And I think it was possible initially for them to accept a different outcome had civilian political forces been more united, more determined, and themselves, if they'd had a clear idea of where they wanted to go as well. The armed forces started after a few months to formulate their own key goals more clearly. For instance, by July approximately, and certainly by October or November, it became evident that they were seeking a formal supra-constitutional status, something I'll talk about a little bit later. It clearly regarded this status as a formula to protect its interests and its autonomy under any future civilian government. So in other words, from the revolution until late in the year in 2011, it appeared ready to accept a new kind of civil military modus vivendi. However, the coup d'etat of July 2013 set the armed forces on a new path. But even then, the specific form and direction of the involvement of the military and state institutions in political life and in the economy were not yet determined fully. They were not inevitable. Clearly, the military had become again the most central and powerful political power by taking power. But that doesn't really tell us what it wanted over the long term. And what was more important really was the presidency of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi in May 2014. He has given shape and direction to politics, to government, to state building, and to the economy and business in Egypt in a way that his predecessors had not done, and that the armed forces probably didn't know how to do if they hadn't had someone like him who took charge, had a certain charismatic personality, and was the single most powerful figure within the military. What, in my view, the changes that have happened since then in the military's position and its role in the state and politics and the economy amount to a fundamental transformation. This is not simply a repetition of Egyptian authoritarian rule of Abdel Nasser or Anwar Sadat or Hosni Mubarak. This is a new kind of authoritarianism. And as I'll discuss later, this goes with a new social model, a new social or socio-political alliance. Now, let me flesh this out a little bit. So for a brief period, the military, after February 2011, when Mubarak transferred his presidential powers to the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, the military experimented with multi-party democratic politics and with a civilian presidency. So you may remember that in 2012, first of all, 2011, there were parliamentary elections, followed then by elections for the Senate, Majlis al-Shura, and which were later canceled by a court decision. But also they allowed a presidential election in which the Muslim Brotherhood put forward Mohammed Morsi as its candidate, and Morsi became president in June 2012 for almost exactly 1 year, until he was deposed and imprisoned. So what we see, I think, in that early period was the emergence of two trends with the military. First, an acceptance of a new political formula where the civilians could conduct elections and take office in the presidency as well as in government at the level of the Council of Ministers, but where the military also now consciously sought to be an autonomous power and increasingly wanted formal autonomy. Because until 2019, and this is something I'm coming back to, until then, although the army was powerful, and although in the constitution, the defense budget was not discussed except as a single number put to the parliament for approval, there were certain, obviously there was some freedom for the military, some autonomy for the military, and there was a lot of de facto autonomy. But this was not enshrined clearly and explicitly in the constitution. So the military, I think, clearly we can see signs over the last 10 years was trying to assert its autonomy from any future president in case another president came in future who was either a civilian or from the opposition like Mohammed Morsi, or maybe someone who like Abdel Fattah Sisi would become too independent and where there would be a disagreement. And we saw this when there was a negotiation between the military and the president prior to the 2019 constitutional referendum over how many terms President Sisi could run for president again and how long each term would be. He wanted to extend further and for a longer period. Finally, he had to accept a smaller period of time to be president. And this suggests that the military put pressure. They didn't want him to become too powerful. They wanted also to open the door for other people within their ranks to be president in future. This at least is how it was seen from the outside. What we do know, and this is really important, is that the revised constitution of 2019 awarded the Egyptian armed forces several important rights and powers that had never been in the constitution before. Firstly, the unilateral right to determine when conditions require its intervention in national politics and in government. In other words, the armed forces can determine on their own, for themselves, if the state is in danger, if the political system is in danger, if the civil nature of the state is in danger, if democracy is in danger, according to their interpretation. There were no conditions. It did not require parliamentary confirmation. It did not require presidential ratification. It has the unilateral right to say, the country is in danger, we have a duty to step in and correct things. And anyone who has followed civil-military relations anywhere else or is an expert maybe on Turkey, you will know that this is the exact model that the Turkish armed forces followed in 1983 when they returned power to civilians after having taken power in 1980. In the 3-year period of military rule, they changed the constitution, giving themselves that veto power over national policy and politics, so that if the government did anything they felt was a threat to political stability or social peace, and this could of course include workers' strikes or things in the economy, the Turkish armed forces reserved the right to intervene. So the Egyptians, and I know this for a fact from my research and having worked in Egypt and with many figures, including from the military, I know that they were looking at the Turkish example from as early as 2011, as they started to ask themselves the question, how do we protect our core interests and make sure that these protections are formalized, are codified in legal documents like the Constitution? Because they realized that relying on a strong president like Mubarak to protect them was no longer a sufficient condition for protection. This is why they tried to formalize this. And I knew that they were referring to the Turkish example from 2011 at least. What's also interesting here, of course, is the fact that it took them 8 years before they got formal protection. They took power in 2013. The former head of military intelligence, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who was then defense minister, became president. And it still took another 5 years for the military to gain the formal protection they wanted, which suggests an internal negotiation and sort of divergence between the president and various senior officers. Although we don't have, great visibility on this, but this seems to be suggested. The army also won the right to approve whoever the president nominates to be Minister of Defense. The Minister of Defense always has to be a uniformed officer. And in effect, the Constitution has left no civilian authority above the army. Even the president does not have clear or unambiguous authority higher than the military. We know that Sisi in today's Egypt is the most powerful single person in Egypt and can fire and hire the chief of staff, the commander-in-chief, the minister of defense, anyone he wants, definitely. However, this is part of a wider web of negotiation where he gives things to please the army and different factions within the army and in the security services, as well as requiring them to give him loyalty. So he is not a dictator who has total power. Like all dictators, actually, there's a negotiation and a balance and a bargaining with different key elements within his own coalition. So, and we've seen many instances of how Sisi maintains his position. He frequently rotates commanders. He has relied on people who are relatives, his sons, his father-in-law, his son-in-law, etc. He puts them in key positions in the military or in security. He also has licensed many military agencies and police and security agencies to open up commercial companies, to engage in the market, and to form joint ventures with private sector and non-Egyptian companies. All of this is a way of giving everyone a share in the pie so that they will remain loyal. This will go on working as long as the economy is growing or is doing reasonably, or Egypt is bringing in lots of support from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, from the Gulf states. But if there's ever a shortage of capital flowing into Egypt, then this arrangement might stop working so well. And already we know that Egypt is very heavily in debt, both external debt and domestic debt, some of the highest levels it has ever reached in the past. So lastly, on this point, before I pause for a round of discussion, I'll just note that part of the new politics in Egypt is a situation where the armed forces are the central, most important state institution. And Sisi relies on them to lead his plan for rebuilding and remodeling Egypt in the political sphere by spearheading a new form of nationalism, which is much more aggressive and chauvinistic, spearheading his economic plans, but also spearheading a new social alliance, all of these things which I will discuss later. But part of this arrangement also is a big shift in the previous balance of power, where under Mubarak, for 20 years, most of his focus and his attention and the investment of the budget and resources was in the Ministry of Interior, because it's the Ministry of Interior, the police, the internal security agencies that he relied on to support regime power, not the army. The army was kept in the barracks and neutralized. Since 2013, however, the relationship has gone the other way. Now the army is back in the role of the big brother. The Ministry of Interior enjoys a lot of autonomy as well, because Sisi needs its support, so he allows them to do whatever they do. A lot of the stories about torture, corruption, the murder, for instance, of the Italian PhD student Giulio Regeni 5 or 6 years ago in Cairo was conducted probably not on the orders of Sisi at all, but rather by police forces that had the autonomy to do whatever they want, and which basically Sisi cannot punish. So nonetheless, there is a clear order of importance, with Sisi at the top, followed by the army, and then followed by the Ministry of Interior, and then probably one could say after that by the judiciary, by judges, as part of the new coalition that governs Egypt, which is based almost entirely and exclusively on state institutions. So in this picture then, to finish, because of these different competitions and rivalries within the military and between the military and these other agencies, Sisi is able to keep playing the balancing game between them. So there's little chance of a united coalition against him, not for now, and not while he serves his remaining 1 or 2 presidential terms. But it also means that the armed forces have little reason to dismantle this ruling coalition in favor of effective civilian governance. There is no reason for them to want that. So I will take up that theme when I discuss the economic interests of the army, but I will now pause for a round of questions and discussion.
Alors, je suis particulièrement, je trouve extrêmement intéressant, et c'est un peu dommage, franchement, que tout le monde n'ait pas pu profiter de votre prise de parole, mais peut-être que dorénavant, ça sera mieux. Moi, ce qui m'intéresse beaucoup, c'est la question des tiraillements internes à l'armée. Vous avez parlé de internal negotiation au sein de l'armée. On a toujours entendu parler de ça, et à un moment donné, en recherchant des facteurs qui pourraient permettre de trouver une issue à la situation catastrophique à la fois des droits humains, mais aussi des droits économiques, et même la situation économique du pays qui est catastrophique. Est-ce qu'on peut en savoir plus sur ces tiraillements? Est-ce que là, il y a vraiment des lignes qui s'affrontent ou des manières de concevoir la direction du pays qui s'affrontent? Est-ce qu'il y a là un facteur, disons, potentiellement d'un changement de la situation qui viendrait de l'intérieur même de l'armée? Parce que on l'a déjà entendu dire ça souvent, on peut plus ou moins y croire, mais quelle est la réalité de ça? Est-ce que vous pouvez approfondir sur ce point, s'il vous plaît, Yezid?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I really would love to respond in French and make these technical problems easier. Désolé. We don't know for sure, first of all. I also think that any internal disagreement it's not clear what it is about, if it's about political direction, economic direction, or what. Mm. Some people believe that the problem is that what are known as institutionalists are afraid for the professional development of the armed forces because it is so heavily involved in politics and in the economy. And they want to retreat from these things so as to focus on their professional development. But I think for now and for the foreseeable future, 5, 8, 10 years, that the senior officers are very invested, very involved in economic and business activity. For now, they are still on an upward growth curve. So the system has not yet reached a crisis point where the costs of continuing on the current path start to become higher and higher. So far, it has been possible for the senior officers, like senior state officials, to ignore increasing poverty, to ignore the deep economic problems, structural problems of the economy, and to continue with the same method of governance, to follow the same policies. So I think that there are no issues that will force the discussion to become more critical inside the army. Mm. I think the momentum is still for greater military involvement. This policy has not yet reached the stage where it is running into very severe difficulties and therefore is starting to fail, which would then produce deeper divisions within the army or within the government. We're not at that stage.
Mm. Ok, merci. Merci beaucoup. Une question qui est mise sur le chat et que je vais vous transmettre de la part de NG. Vous avez mentionné l'influence des pays du Golfe. Pouvez-vous revenir sur les relations qu'ont ces pays ou d'autres avec le régime militaire de Sissi? Ah, on n'entend pas Giovanna. Vous ne m'entendez pas parce que moi je suis sur le canal anglais normalement. Donc, j'écoute en anglais. Donc du coup, il faut que je pense à passer en français quand je parle. Mais j'ai compris.
Bon. Shall I answer? Okay, good question. And also, I think one of the aspects of the relationship between the armed forces and the president is the ability of the president to demonstrate that he can bring international support for Egypt, for the economy, for the treasury, for the budget, to bring business and to bring capital, money, and also to protect Egypt from criticism about human rights or about democracy. And so if the president were to face difficulties in the international arena in foreign policy, then I think we might see more unhappiness among the senior military in his performance. And so, of course, when, say, the former US President Donald Trump called Sisi his favorite dictator and basically allowed Sisi to do whatever he wanted, then this strengthened Sisi's position domestically in the country and with the army. Now that there's a new president in the United States, Joseph Biden, who's made it very evident that the relationship with Egypt will be cooled down a bit. It won't be totally changed, but it will change a bit. This potentially, could lead to more pressure on Sisi. However, of course, Sisi then turns to France, he turns to Egypt, to Russia, to China, to Italy, even to Germany to get political and military financial support. And so he's still able to demonstrate that even if the Americans put pressure, which they're not really doing, then he is able to secure the interests of the army with huge arms deals, starting with French arms deals and Italian and Russian and German. The fact that he can come to the Champs-Élysées and be given the Légion d'honneur, of course, is also for him symbolically important. And I mention this because I think Western countries, especially in Europe, underestimate their ability to make, to increase the cost for Sisi of his human rights and his political behavior. The Gulf, of course, is important because the Gulf is not interested so much in democracy or human rights. It has an interest in geostrategic stability. And also, of course, the Gulf countries, especially Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, have special interests in the Red Sea area, in Yemen, in Eritrea, and Ethiopia, and in Sudan, and in Libya. And in these areas, it's very interesting to see how the Gulf seeks a close relationship with Egypt, but Egypt has different interests in these same countries. It's somewhat a paradox that Egypt finds itself sometimes on the other side, or at least in a different position than the Emirates or the Saudis on Yemen, for instance, or on Ethiopia. So the relationship so far has worked because the Gulf countries have provided $25 billion of support, either cash or credit or oil assistance in the first 1.5 years after the military coup d'etat of 2013. So it's a very important relationship. But the Gulf countries, for different reasons, have reduced the level of their support for Egypt in the last few years. Still, it's very important for Egypt because it ensures a certain amount of political support, but also a certain amount of income and investment. So these foreign relations are critical, though, however, again, just to remind you that they're critical for the balance between Sisi and the military. Sisi needs to keep demonstrating that he is able to bring in, high-tech aircraft, combat aircraft, Rafale aircraft, MiG, Sukhoi aircraft, amphibian naval vessels, all these different things to show that he is helping the army develop professionally. What, of course, some people, and I speak, for instance, to American officers who work with the Egyptian military, they don't think the Egyptian military is actually an effective military force. But there's a lot of theater. And so Sisi is demonstrating, in a very theatrical way that he can bring enormous amounts of weapons, making Egypt one of the biggest weapons importers in the world today. Although it can't afford these weapons, and although the defense budget never changes. And it's a big question about where the funding comes for these weapons. We'll talk about the economic aspect in a moment anyway. So I'm conscious that time is going. So.
Oui, time is going. But moi, pardon, je passe au français. Je voudrais juste, à moins que vous ayez une autre petite question qui n'est pas si petite que ça peut-être, et après on passe au point suivant si vous voulez bien. Vous avez parlé, ça m'a surpris, du modèle turc. pour Sisi. Donc, il cherchait à ressembler au modèle de gouvernance de la Turquie, alors qu'on sait que la Turquie et l'Égypte sont totalement sur des options stratégiques contradictoires et ne sont pas du tout amis, les gouvernements égyptiens et turcs. Et donc, ça m'a un peu surpris. Peut-être que vous parliez exclusivement de la place de l'armée, peut-être, je ne sais pas. En tout cas, j'aimerais bien avoir une clarification sur le fait que le modèle turc est la référence pour le président égyptien.
I think that's a very important question, but it's probably better. I mean, I'm going to, the real contrast or comparison with Turkey is in fact in the next two sections in terms of the approach to the economy and in terms of social transformation. So if you don't mind, I think I'm going to come back to Turkey and Egypt in that context. You know, because now we look at what's happening right now between Turkey and Egypt. That doesn't tell us about the past 60 years and why we're here. I mean, how did, the real question is, how did Turkey move from being under military rule and with frequent military interventions in politics to a situation where the civilian government can remove 40% of the senior officer corps, as it did in 2016, and the army remains obedient? This is a total revolution, if you like. And it's a complete change. We can't imagine this in Egypt. So the question is, you know, Turkey and Egypt in 1950 or 1960 were on the same level of politics and of economic development and social development by most indicators or most measures. How do we explain two very different political and economic trajectories, where today Turkey is a middle income country with, you know, a large diversified economy, and Egypt is one of the slowest among its peer group of countries, all the countries with which it was compared in 1960, South Korea, Taiwan, Philippines, Turkey, Brazil, and others, all of them have achieved, you know, 500, 600% increases in most measures of productivity, income, and so on. And Egypt is the bottom. How do we explain this? So I want to come back to that once I discuss the economy and the social dimensions. Maybe we should move on to that. It's up to you. Yeah. Shall I? Yeah, okay. Well, turning to the economic dimension, I'm going to look at two things here. One is the growing economic role of the military. The military today play a huge role in the economy. And by economy, I mean in markets, in other words, in selling goods, commodities, services, but also in providing public works and public procurements, in other words, government contracts. But also what's really important here as a way of understanding the politics and the future trajectory is to understand the relationship between what the military does in the economy and the private sector of Egypt. And now here, I'll start with the first item. In other words, the business interests or the economic interests of the military. Now, the Egyptian military, like many other armed forces in developing countries and not just in developing countries, have a range of businesses, agriculture, manufacturing industry, technology-based IT, civilian consumer compliances, refrigerators, air conditioning, solar energy, many things that are performed by formally registered state-owned military companies. The Chinese People's Army has this, the Indonesian army, the Pakistani army, the Bangladeshi army, the Turkish army. Many countries around the world have armies that run businesses in different ways with different histories. So this is not unique, but the size of the Egyptian military's economic role has become major under Abdel Fattah Sisi since 2013. It went from being relatively small in what we call an enclave up to 2011 And since then, it has broken out and is now expanding into many new sectors. And so it's increasing in scale, in other words, in the total volume, but also in the scope, in the diversity of things it does. So the military now produces or supplies massive infrastructure projects. They build highways, bridges, tunnels, irrigation canals. In 2014-15, they built the expansion to the Suez Canal, which of course now is in the news. What they built was a long second canal next to the old one in a different area than is currently in the news. These are huge infrastructure projects, and they serve various purposes, one of which is that the president feels that or believes that by investing in infrastructure, this will generate more economic activity, but also attract foreign businesses to strategic locations like the Suez Canal, where you have transport, international shipping, services for shipping, the possibility of creating industrial zones and doing export, re-export, etc. So the idea is to create a massive economic, industrial, and transport complex in this area, which is an area that is totally controlled by the military because it used to be the front line between Egypt and Israel during the war. So this area is designated as a strategic military zone, although of course it's been at peace now for 40 or 50 years. And what that means is that the military control all these state-owned companies and agencies that run all economic activities, the port authorities, airport authorities, the Suez Canal Authority, all of these and their subsidiary companies and agencies are headed by retired generals. And they work, of course, closely with the Ministry of Defense. State land in this area can be leased, but cannot be sold to any actor without the prior approval of the Ministry of Defense. So it has enormous influence and leverage over the use of state resources, state companies, state machinery, and state land. And in this area also, the military is often the business partner of foreign and Egyptian private businesses that want to invest in this area. So all of them end up having to buy the right to use land from the Ministry of Defense to allow the Ministry of Defense to give it a share of their investments so that the military become partners basically more or less for free by allowing land use. And of course, there's also a huge problem because the military in Egypt comes exclusively under military law and military courts, which means that for business disagreements or disputes, civilian courts in Egypt or international courts do not apply. So I'm giving you a little idea of the big scale of the military's economic role and the fact that the state, thanks to the president, has given total political support and legal support with many new laws, empowering the military as an economic actor. I mentioned earlier how presidential decrees have allowed different military agencies to set up their own companies to compete in civilian markets, either in partnership with private and foreign domestic and foreign companies or on their own. Now this, as you can imagine, has huge impacts for the market and for other companies, for civilian companies, because the army don't pay taxes, they don't pay customs duties, they receive hard currency, dollars, euros, at preferential rates. They have easy or free access to land, free labor from conscripts. They travel, their trucks travel on national highways that are managed by the military, so they don't pay for the use of the highways, unlike civilians, and so on and so on and so on. They have expanded into new sectors, and this is one of the most important dimensions, that sectors like cement production, steel production, fertilizer, and others previously were dominated almost entirely by the private sector, or at least by the private and public sector companies, civilian companies. In the last few years only, the military have built their own cement factories, have purchased steel factories, have created a marketing company which has become a monopoly to market all fertilizers and phosphates produced in Egypt. So even if they're produced by the private sector, they have to be sold through this military-dominated marketing company. So in other words, the military is now expanding into areas where it is in direct competition with the private sector. Now, this is partly interesting because, of course, Egypt officially is committed to a free market economy and, receives a lot of European assistance, access to European markets, as well as to American markets, with special or preferential privileged agreements and access on the grounds that it's a free market economy. In reality, however, there are massive subsidies, hidden, direct, indirect. Egypt has the highest or the second highest rate of what are known as non-tariff barriers to trade. So if you are aware of the World Trade Organization, of which, of course, France and the EU are a part, Egypt is a member. Now, that means that they must keep their customs tariffs for the entry of imports into their own markets at a certain agreed lower rate. But the non-tariff barrier is a way in which many countries all over the world create other barriers to block imports. For instance, they have demands, sanitary demands, health demands, other kinds of demands that are technical. And so they say, we're not raising tariffs, but you have to comply with, health or cultural or other kinds of conditions. Egypt has the highest or second highest rate of use of these obstacles. So what it's done is it's created a protected economy, which is controlled by the state, in which the private sector nominally is responsible for 70 or 75% of the total economy in terms of the production of goods and services, of the creation of jobs, and so on. But in reality, it's still the state that determines all decisions, investment, where to invest, how to invest, by all economic actors because of a complex procurement system, regulation system, import system, and so on. Private companies that, for instance, refuse to pay a bribe or to give a share to a senior state official, or in the past to the presidency under Mubarak, or now to the military, will find that they don't get a license to use land that they need for, let's say, a new factory or a new farm, until they agree to, to the terms and conditions. Maybe this company will be importing some goods it needs from outside. It will find that the goods stay in the port and don't get cleared from customs until they accept conditions. So there are many different ways in which the state and the state agencies like the military control the economic space. And what this has done, one of the people who've done a lot of work on this is based in Paris, teaches at Sciences Po, Ishaq Diwan, have done a lot of very detailed research and shown how the role of political and personal connections for economic performance of private companies means that there is very little innovation, market innovation, technological innovation in Egypt, because companies know that if they invest in research and development and in innovation, it doesn't improve their profits. What helps them is having political connections. That's how they get access to markets, to imports, to raw materials, to land, to many things they need in order to be competitive. So the military now has become the principal agency that Sisi relies on to lead in infrastructure construction, in housing construction. Now, there's a lot of talk in Egypt about building new housing for low-income groups, what's known as social housing, like the HLM in France. The reality is that by far, the majority of funding for housing in Egypt is going into so-called new smart cities. Smart meaning digital, eco-friendly, with 24/7 surveillance of the streets and everywhere. They're creating a series of so-called desert cities or smart cities in luxurious locations on the Mediterranean coast or the Red Sea coast, with walls all around and high skyscrapers, high buildings, steel, glass, luxury, modeled on the Dubai model of luxury apartments. These are being sold to people from the upper middle class, 1% of the population or 2% of the population. So most of the housing that the military is building or is responsible for is actually aimed at a very particular target and is not actually for the 99% of the Egyptian population who can't afford it. I will come later to some of the statistics when I discuss the social dimension. But to go back to the economy, the military is the spearhead of this massive investment by the state, mostly using borrowed money, in real estate development, in building cities for the rich, basically. Right now, for those of you who are on Twitter, if you follow the correct thread, you will see the story going around. It's been around now since August, I think, last year. This government, the Ministry of Transport, which is headed by an army general, is investing $23 billion, not Egyptian pounds, dollars, in building a high-speed TGV, in other words, connection between 9 of these upper bourgeois cities, the new capital, Ain al-Sukhna on the Red Sea, the new Alamein city on the Mediterranean coast. 9, very deluxe cities are being connected by a high-speed train that almost no one in Egypt can afford to ride on. This is the kind of economic investment strategy. So Egypt is trying under Sisi to be like Saudi Arabia, or like Dubai, invest in high-profile, sort of sexy real estate projects. The problem is that Egypt doesn't have surplus wealth like the Emirates or Saudi Arabia have. One of Egypt's biggest problems is it has a very low rate of domestic savings and a very low rate of domestic surplus. Now, to come back to the private sector for a moment, so I can stop and give a chance for discussion on this. There are 2 things happening here that are different from before. One is that the military, as I mentioned, has entered sectors like cement and steel, where it's actively undermining the private sector. The share of the military in cement and steel has gone from 0% to a quarter of the total in these 2 sectors in just a few years. That is a tremendous change, and it's forced numerous private and public sector companies working in these areas to suffer big losses and in some cases to go bankrupt. So the private sector has been hit directly by what the military is doing. And this is paradoxical because Sisi needs private sector investment. He keeps complaining that the private sector is not doing enough to help build Egypt. But he pursues policies that directly undermine the private sector. And the most important indicator here is that private sector's capital investment in Egypt today is less than it was during the so-called socialist period under Jamal Abdel Nasser in the 1960s. Imagine, under socialism or semi-socialism, the private sector invested more in the economy than it does today under a government that claims to be a free market government. So we could discuss maybe a lot more in a moment in the discussion. I want to stop here to allow more time for this. But it's fascinating, and this will be the last bit of information I'll say before stopping, that one consequence of the Egyptian path to development, and here's also the comparison with Turkey is very interesting. As I said earlier, Turkey and Egypt started at the same level of capital formation, of economic development by various measures in the 1950s. They both pursued industrial strategies known as import substituting industrialization to increase domestic savings, domestic investment, to reduce imports, and so on. But after that, they took 2 different paths. Egypt followed what was known as a non-capitalist path to development, also known as state capitalism, or as Arab socialism, a sort of soft socialism. Turkey, on the other hand, moved in a capitalist path to development, and where the state heavily invested in supporting the private sector and in building up the industrial base. I'm not saying what's good or bad, right or wrong here. I'm simply pointing out that they pursued 2 different paths. 6 years later, in Turkey, what developed was a private sector where you had a large significant number of large companies, a much larger number of medium-sized companies, and then a very large number of small businesses. But you had a sort of reasonably sized or shaped pyramid, let's say. In Egypt, out of 2 million non-farm enterprises, in other words, everything outside of a farm, out of 2 million, exactly 20,000, i.e. 1%, count as large or medium businesses. 99% are small or micro or nano businesses. In other words, a man with a kiosk selling sandwiches. So this is a very strange profile for a private sector, 1% at the top, and then nothing until you get 99% at the bottom. This tells you that the private sector operates in an extremely strange political economy environment where investing, growing, diversifying, innovating is not a good strategy for growth. There is no growth. So Turkey and Egypt have followed these two very different paths with very different political outcomes, as I'm going to discuss when I come back to the social dimension. I'm going to stop for now and have another round of discussion. I really hope that you've been able to follow the French translation for this. I do already see, by the way, a question about startups.
Je pense que là, les choses vont beaucoup mieux. J'ai deux questions, pas moi, que je vais vous transmettre. La première, ce sera directement la personne qui va le dire. Dima Al-Sajdi, veux-tu bien poser ta question, peut-être même en allumant ta caméra?
Oui, bonjour et merci beaucoup pour votre intervention. Moi, j'avais plusieurs questions. Maintenant, juste pour réagir à votre première et deuxième partie. Pour la première partie de votre intervention, vous avez parlé d'un changement d'autoritarisme. Vous avez parlé d'une différence de l'autoritarisme sous Nasser, Sadat et ensuite Moubarak. Et dans la deuxième partie, vous avez parlé du secteur privé en disant que sous Nasser, il y avait, alors que c'était le socialisme, et donc il y avait des investissements pour le secteur privé qui étaient plus importants que ce qu'on voit aujourd'hui. Alors, qu'en est-il de la période de Sadat, c'est-à-dire la période d'infitah de Sadat, et ensuite, on sait très bien qu'il y avait aussi une implication très importante du secteur privé sous Moubarak, c'est-à-dire avec tout ce qu'il a investi, tout ce qu'il a laissé passer aussi dans le secteur privé pour les gens, pour son entourage, les gens qui étaient proches de ses fils, etc. Donc ça, c'était la première partie de la question. Comment on peut comparer ces deux périodes avec la période actuelle? Et quand vous parlez d'un changement d'autoritarisme et ensuite de secteur privé, alors si j'ai bien compris, il y a quand même beaucoup de choses qui changent par rapport à l'armée. C'est-à-dire qu'on a l'impression que ce n'est pas la même armée. Est-ce que vous confirmez ça et sur quels aspects exactement? Et merci beaucoup.
On va passer à une deuxième question et après vous répondrez. La deuxième question est posée par Sophie Guldner. Est-ce que vous voulez la dire ou vous voulez que je la dise?
Oui. Moi, en fait, ce qui m'intéresserait, c'est de savoir est-ce que le régime égyptien essaye d'encourager, a mis en œuvre des dispositifs pour encourager l'entrepreneuriat, notamment dans le secteur du numérique, où je pense, voilà, ou dans d'autres secteurs innovants.
Donc, la création d'entreprises pour la jeunesse, c'est ça, en fait, n'est-ce pas, Sophie?
Ça peut être la jeunesse ou d'autres cibles.
D'accord. Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres questions? On peut commencer par répondre à ces questions.
Okay, very, very good questions, very interesting ones. Maybe I'll start with the last question first about entrepreneurship and startups. There's a lot of official discourse about encouraging young entrepreneurs. Some of the investments made in the Suez Canal zone, for instance, include creating so-called cities or zones where infrastructure is created and then young entrepreneurs are offered special deals to come and start businesses. This also includes assistance with training and support to, or discounts for people to go to the far south of the country in Upper Egypt, in Said, in areas like Toshka, where there's agricultural and land reclamation projects and where they're encouraged to come and take some land. And there's been a scheme for many, many years in Egypt also to give university graduates a bit of land in these desert land reclamation projects so as to allow them to start their own little farms. So there's always been these projects. The problem is so far they have rarely succeeded. And despite the training and despite the discourse about startups, there have been some serious obstacles. So part of the discourse in the last year and a half or so is about tawteen, localizing technology, about technology transfer. Now, this is something that, Nasser started with, and he said, Egypt is going to produce everything from needles to rockets. And now we're back where the president says, about a year and a half or 2 years ago, he suddenly thought we need to transfer technology. So now every official, every officer involved in the military economy, whenever they make new investments or start a new project or open a new factory, they say this is to serve technology transfer and localizing technology. Now, this is an admirable goal, but to do this, you need a certain infrastructure. What you need is investment in research and development locally. This means investment in the education system, at least at the university level. It means investment not simply in salaries, but in laboratories and in access to information, in open debate about scientific and technological and other kinds of information and so on. But this is happening in a country that dislikes free information, even in the scientific domain, and that tries to monopolize the access with privileged actors. So in reality, what happens, and I've tracked this in much detail, for instance, now Egypt is talking about indigenizing, in other words, localizing the manufacture of electric cars, of buses, of agricultural vehicles, among other examples. In most of these projects, they have a partner, Chinese partner, Russian, Belarusian partner, Ukrainian, etc. When you look at the detail of the contract, what the Egyptian side will do is to assist with the necessary bureaucratic permits and import licenses and with the land. And what the foreign partner does is they provide the technology and the equipment and the know-how and the skilled labor and so on. And in almost all of these cases, the local content level never exceeds 45%. And anyone who understands the relationship between adding value, it's all about increasing local content. How much of the commodity is produced locally, and to reach a high level of local content, which means you have more income, more profit margin when you sell, you need to have a higher level of technological know-how and engineering, manufacturing know-how. But in reality, behind all the talk about localizing, this is just an excuse in many cases, sadly, for importing. So the military agency or the military company becomes an import agency, not an actual manufacturing agency. And much of the manufacturing is in the form of assembling kits, where the most difficult components, say in the fast trains that they're going to buy, or previous number of trains that they bought from Italy, what they assemble is the chassis, which is the simple item. But then the control system, the electronic control, the engines, all these complicated things are made in Italy and then shipped over and put into the chassis. So now I wish that Egypt was progressing on this front. But what I fear is what's happening is that this talk of startups and entrepreneurials and so on is just a facade for maintaining the same system without necessarily increasing productivity. And what we do know about startups also is, on the one side, there are an amazing number of wonderful, creative, young Egyptians who understand technology in many different fields. There's no shortage of, highly professional, highly capable Egyptians in every field. But it's a system that demands a price in return for giving them a license. So what we know about the startups, we don't have official documents, but we know from anecdotal evidence that starting about 2 years ago, if not a bit longer, officers, and it's not just officers, it's also other, influential bureaucrats, understood that startups is where there's a lot of money. And because there's a startup agency under the Ministry of Investment and Public Sector Enterprise as well, I forget where exactly the fund is, but there's a fund for startups. So what they use is their privileged political power to ensure that when entrepreneurs apply to the startup fund for credit and for assistance, that a condition is imposed that they put an officer on their board, or they give a share of equity, in other words, a share of the company being set up in return for giving them the license. This is how the real economy works. And the people who escape this are either Egyptians who emigrate and go to Europe or North America, in many cases, or are very large companies like Sawiris, El Suwaidi, Mansour, and others, who, because many years ago, they transferred much of their business outside Egypt, so that the majority of their capital is international. This has allowed them to operate in Egypt without being so vulnerable to pressure of this kind, to blackmail, to chantage, and where the government and the military need them because they have access to international technology and credit and markets and technical know-how. So there, the relationship is a bit more balanced. But if you're a small entrepreneur in Egypt, you are at the mercy of the bureaucrats and the officers who control your access to licenses, to permits, to imports, to land, to water, to transport, everything. Now, I've said rather more than I needed maybe about this, but I want to come back to Dima's question, which is very interesting. How to compare these periods and changes in the armed forces. There's, of course, a lot of continuity, first of all. But what's very interesting is that there's been continuity and change all along, since the 1950s and onwards. Part of the continuity, in a way you could say, is different presidents have never had a clear economic vision of saying, this is the path of Egypt to sustainable economic growth and to lift people out of poverty. There's no specific idea or plan, unlike in Turkey, where the military believed in the model that emerged from the 1950s of capitalist path to development led by industrialization and also led by large industrial conglomerates, as in South Korea or as in Japan, the really, really big companies which were to lead the economy, like Samsung or Hyundai in Korea, or Mitsubishi, Toyota, Sony, etc. in Japan. In Turkey, Koç, Sabancı, Ake, and the military pension fund, OYAK, are the 4 biggest holding companies in all of Turkey. This was a clear model in the military's mind. I'm not saying, again, it's better or anything or right or wrong. I'm just saying that in Egypt, what has shaped economic policy in every phase has been the president's search for capital. The one thing that is always constant in Egypt since Nasser's days is the need for regular, periodic injections of capital into the economy because the economy is not producing enough surplus capital of its own. Nasser started by taking land away from the big landowners in the hope that the urban bourgeoisie, the industrial and merchant capitalists, would generate growth and lift the country. When that failed, he nationalized Greek, Italian, Jewish capital in Egypt. Then when that didn't work, and the Egyptian bourgeoisie, the private sector, did not deliver what he wanted, he nationalized the whole economy and transferred the private sector into the public sector with all of its culture and attitudes and mentality. And there's a wonderful book about that that was written in the 1980s, describing that transition, very fascinating book. The point is that what drives even today Sisi is he needs capital somehow. What he has failed to do, like everyone before him, is to work out what are the problems in the Egyptian economy that block the increase in domestic savings and in domestic surplus, how to increase productivity, how to increase domestic investment. He's not solving these things. Instead, he's received $25 billion, as I said earlier, from the Gulf in the first year and a half, $18 billion from the IMF since 2016 in assistance, and other forms of assistance. And right now, the biggest earner of hard currency in Egypt is not hard currency earner, is not exports. It's remittances from Egyptian workers outside Egypt. This is the largest source of hard currency today. And most of the exports are raw materials or agricultural food, marble, phosphates. These are not high value exports. Egypt has not been able to go from the bottom of what is known as the global value chain. They haven't even started. And this is partly because the real economy, the physical economy, is in this somewhat protected area. It's protected from the worst parts of globalization, but it's also failed to increase value production. So I mean, the comparison is one of both continuity and change, but I think what is happening now, and I argued this in a paper that I published in January, very recently with the London School of Economics, on a new kind of state capitalism in Egypt. Nasser had the first kind, Mubarak had the second, where he created some privatization. And as Dima noted, there was, the infitah, liberalization under Sadat, and then privatization under Mubarak. But because the state remained dominant, the privatization created what we know as crony capitalism. So only people who had privileged personal or political access or paid bribes could get the contracts and the licenses. So privatization did not produce, it increased the share of the private sector overall, but it did not produce a free market economy. It produced a crony economy, which is not productive even today. So the last comparison then is really that Sisi is creating what I call a new kind of state capitalism, in which he's trying to regain the central role of the state because he wants political control. And to do that, you need state control. But he also knows that the state doesn't have enough money, so he borrows a lot, and he keeps inviting the private sector to buy shares in public companies, including military companies. And we have seen this over the last 3 years, where he asked for military companies to sell shares in the stock exchange. That never happened because the military companies don't want what is known as full financial disclosure of opening up their books. And if you don't open your books, you can't deal in the stock exchange. So now the plan is, no, what we'll do is we'll put them in the sovereign wealth fund of Egypt. And you can invest as a private investor in these companies, which are held and controlled by the sovereign wealth fund, and the head of the wealth fund, of course, is the president. So he's creating bodies outside the state bureaucracy to manage the economy and to manage investment, while leaving all these private investments in public companies. They don't become privately owned and privately controlled. The key shareholder is still the state. So all of this is about attracting money somehow. And the other thing that Egypt does under Sisi is to offer very high interest rates to buy government certificates or government bonds. And so they're attracting hot money. If you're sitting in France or Germany and you have money that you couldn't spend during the confinement, during the lockdown, you're looking for somewhere to put your money. Buy Egyptian government bonds. You get 13%, 15% return, which is astronomical. So this is known as hot money. And just last week, $6 billion left Egypt because suddenly American bonds became more attractive. So this is a gamble. This is what is known as a Ponzi scheme. It'll go on working as long as the Americans, the EU, Germany, France want to support the Sisi administration and prevent it from failing. So they allow all this to happen. But if the day comes when the flow of capital slows, the model will fail. I guess, Giovanna, we may need to, I'm sorry, I'm taking rather long with this, but maybe at least to wrap up with the social dimension.
C'est passionnant, c'est extrêmement intéressant et c'est tellement clair que je pense que tout le monde aura profité beaucoup de votre longue réponse très éclairante. Je garde pour moi les questions que j'ai, évidemment. J'ai l'impression que les questions qui vous sont posées, puisqu'il y a une troisième partie qui concerne la dimension plus sociale, si j'ai bien compris, et j'ai l'impression que déjà des questions interviennent là-dessus, et notamment alors la question de NG qui dit quel impact a eu la politique de Sisi et le rôle économique qu'il donne à l'armée sur le chômage. La question de l'emploi donc. Et la même NG veut savoir si la monnaie égyptienne a-t-elle souffert de la politique économique du gouvernement, du président. Voilà, là c'est la première question. Après, il y en aurait une autre qui nous portera sur un autre sujet. Mais déjà, ça.
Okay. You will tell me, if we have more time, I'm very happy to continue to discuss the social dimension. It's just up to you. So, I can start answering these questions and move into the social dimension or not. Que préférez-vous?
Non, mais on va certainement, comme on a perdu un peu de temps.
On va continuer alors.
Si vous êtes d'accord.
Oui, bien sûr. Oui.
Comme on a pris un peu de temps pour mettre en place les
Je suis là, c'est à vous. Ah bon?
Donc, je pense que si on prend 10 minutes de plus...
Ah bon, ok, 10 minutes. Ah bon.
C'est pas beaucoup ça. D'accord, 15 pour moi, tout va bien. C'est vous qui travaillez là, pas moi, pas nous.
Non, je peux continuer même pour une demi-heure. Ça dépend à vous et à votre participant.
On verra. Maintenant, merci beaucoup de toute façon de votre disponibilité. C'est très simple.
Okay, so I'll touch on these questions, but also on the social dimension, because that's really, really important. I believe, in some ways, the most important. Now, let's be clear that when the army delivers public works, housing, infrastructure, it's using government money, and then it gives it to private sector subcontractors. So really, the military isn't increasing or decreasing either the amount of government funds spent on these things or the amount of employment. It claims to be employing or to have employed 5 million people. But if it hadn't been the military, all this work would have been given to private and public sector contractors anyway. What we do know is that the military takes 5, 10, 20% of project value as its profit margin and keeps it. The money doesn't go back to the state treasury, doesn't get accounted in the budget, it disappears. So it's not that the military has a direct impact, good or bad, on unemployment. It's government spending that has the impact. And government spending has increased massively in the last 6 or so years, as has debt. But overall, the social indicators in Egypt of employment are not good. They're getting worse. They are everywhere in the world. The problem is partly that a lot of the investment in Egypt, whether it's foreign investment, goes into the energy sector, where you employ very, very small numbers of people, or in construction in real estate, which of course is very significant, but does not employ the, sufficiently large numbers of people. So the investment strategy is one that favors areas that are capital intensive, which is a problem because Egypt doesn't have much capital, but are not as highly labor intensive as some of the other areas where most people work in Egypt. So there's a challenge there. The Egyptian pound lost a lot of its value over the past 6 years, but this was maybe necessary because the exchange rate didn't reflect the fact that the Egyptian economy is not very productive. So if they didn't do that, Egypt would be in the situation of Lebanon, where the dollar exchange rate was maintained artificially for many years, although the Lebanese economy is not producing enough value to maintain that exchange rate. And this is why I think of the Egyptian financial strategy as being worryingly, dangerously like the Lebanese one. And finally, on gas, of course, a lot of what the government has done in gas or in other areas is good for the economy. They've increased electricity supply, which is really important for production. So there are also very good things. However, the problem is that because the economy is structured in a way that doesn't encourage investment, what this means is that all the increases in income from something like natural gas go to covering the inefficiencies of the rest of the economy and to cover investments that are not producing enough return, enough income. So the gas income is being used to compensate for the mistakes of the economic strategy. If that income was used in ways that actually created social housing for millions of Egyptians, encouraged small and medium businesses to invest more, then that would be a much better use because it would grow the overall economy and diversify it. On housing, let me just remind you, 1 in every 7 Egyptians lives in informal housing or illegal housing. There's a huge crisis in Egypt. And at the same time, there are estimated to be 12 million empty apartments in, I believe, Cairo alone, or at least in Egypt. And the government is quickly building hundreds of thousands of new apartments that no one can afford. 12 million empty apartments, and at least 15 million Egyptians who live in, terrible housing, which is illegal, which means they get no public services for living in illegal settlements. So there are major problems here, and this takes me directly into the social dimension. The key issue I want to focus on, so I can wrap up, is that I mentioned Turkey and said why Turkey is such a fascinating comparison to Egypt. And I said how they started at the same level of development and then moved in different directions. And Turkey now is, a middle-income country, and Egypt is not. What this is also saying, and I described the profile of the private sector. And again, this is not because private sectors are good or bad or anything. It's just a way of understanding and seeing social change and transformation. In Turkey, as I said, the private sector, which I'm using as a proxy or as a measure of middle-class growth, has a certain shape. Also, in Turkey, the middle class is to a large degree autonomous from the state. It is not directly employed by the state, not directly dependent on state contracts, although a large part of it is. And what the neoliberal reforms of the 1980s, and then the relationship with the European Union from 1992 did, the agreement on access to market and so on, is that it forced the military and the old political elite, the Kemalist political elites supported by the military, to allow the emergence of a much larger middle class that was no longer allied with the old state elite, and that is known as the so-called Anatolian Bourgeoisie, the Muslim conservative middle class and industrialists and merchant capitalists and so on. So an enormous new middle class grew that didn't support the old secular political parties or the old state elite. And they supported the Islamic, moderate Islamic parties, such as the AKP of now President Erdogan. In other words, political change came from a massive social change. And this is what empowered Erdogan eventually, or the AKP, starting in 2002 and then 2004, to change the relationship with the military and tell the military, you go back to the barracks. And for once, the military had to obey, partly because this new social force was so massive and so huge. And economic stability and growth depended on the military leaving the power. And there was a special relationship with the EU, where the EU said, you know, you can't hope for accession talks if you don't have freedom and human rights and so on. And the military, because they were keen on a relationship with Europe, pulled back. Egypt has none of this. In Egypt, the state still controls all economic activity directly or indirectly. It's the source of 30% of GDP, which means that a huge amount of contracts going to the private sector and therefore the middle class or parts of the middle class come from the state. So there's a lot of political power and control. And also the so-called middle class in Egypt is almost entirely or very heavily employed by the state. 6 million people work in the civil service of Egypt in education and teaching and bureaucracy and so on, and local government. So directly and indirectly, the role of the state in the creation of the middle class is huge. But this is also why Sisi's Egypt today is suffering, because one of the economic reforms that Sisi has done with encouragement from the IMF and others is to reduce the share of the public sector wage bill. In other words, the salaries of all public servants and beneficiaries of state support have reduced to the lowest level historically for at least 60 years. At a time when, of course, there are other things that are increasing in cost. What this has done is that this middle class, which for 60 years was the main political supporter and main social supporter of every president, from Nasser to Sisi, now this is the class that is shrinking. Its purchasing power is decreasing. And this is where some of the demonstrations and the voices of opposition we are hearing come from, still, you know, very severely repressed. But the middle class is shrinking in Egypt. The latest statistics over the past 3 years showed that extreme poverty, in other words, people living on $1.50 a day, just $1.50 a day, that's what, 1.25 euros, reached 32.5%. It now improved a little bit due to COVID to around 30% of the entire population live on $1.50 a day. If the measure is $5.50 a day, which is a more realistic measure, then nearly 70% of Egyptians are at or below the poverty line. That's because a lot of the middle class have become poor. The world average for 65 countries in one measure that was used to compare, the average for 65 countries is 20%. In Egypt, it's 70%. So this tells you about massive social change in Egypt that is very negative, of course, and terrible for many Egyptians. In the West, the attitude of Western governments and European governments, in effect, is Sisi is a dictator, but maybe he'll be a successful, what is known as a successful development dictator. In other words, he will produce growth that will finally, you know, create wealth, surplus, investment, and jobs, and decrease poverty. The trend for 6 years has been in the opposite direction. And of course, what Western analysts and media and so on tend to focus on is what are known as macroeconomic indicators, that overall growth increases at a good rate. And that is very true. Foreign currency reserves are very strong. That is true. But these macro level indicators don't tell us how the real economy is performing. And the macroeconomic indicators look good because when you get $18 billion coming in from the IMF, and then you spend it or borrow immense amounts of money and spend it on construction, that counts as part of GDP. And so GDP is growing, but it's growing with, immense amounts of assistance, immense amounts of debt, and is being invested in ways that favor the top 1% of the population that can afford these luxury apartments in these luxury cities. And whereas 70% of the population are now at the threshold of poverty. And a lot of this is from the middle class. So this is a transformation, a social transformation, but it's not going in the direction of Turkey's transformation or of Bangladesh's transformation or Brazil's transformation, for countries that were as poor as Egypt and had huge populations as well, and also come from, you know, a Muslim background, or from, you know, in the case of Brazil, obviously a third world non-Muslim background. All these countries with their diverse histories and cultures have performed better than Egypt has in this respect. It's not a cultural issue. It's about the nature of the political economy and how access to market, access to wealth formation is shaped in the case of Egypt. So to conclude, at the macro level, Egypt can survive like this for many years to come, and I think will continue, and this regime will continue, because as long as it performs at this level, it can persuade private investors to buy government bonds. It can persuade Russian, Chinese, Italian, and French companies to come invest in the Suez Canal with the military, even though there is no legal framework to protect the investments. But as long as the political relations are good, then these companies don't worry so much. Some American companies, some British companies I know are more worried about reputational damage, are more worried about the risk to their investment. But some countries, of course, and some companies don't assess risk in the same way. But I'm just, you know, giving you a few little ideas of how ultimately this Egyptian presidency can continue this strategy so long as international players are willing to support it politically, protect it politically, and support it financially and economically. Unfortunately, what this means is that instead of increasing a free market economy, or increasing economic democracy, or improving poverty, or equity and what is known as stakeholder or shareholder among the entire population, what is happening is investment in luxury cities and in luxury high-speed trains and in luxury commodities at a time when the amounts of state investment in helping small businesses or entrepreneurs or youth, etc., are a very small proportion. And instead of which we have domination of media companies by the military and security services, which over the past decade, over 6 or 7 years, bought often coercively many media production and broadcasting companies so as to totally dominate public space and public discourse with a nationalist discourse. And at the same time, a discourse which says, you know, the military is giving us all these wonderful things and hiding the fact that the military keeps all the income. It takes money from companies sometimes where the companies have to deliver a project at a loss. And they still accept this because they know that if they don't accept this contract, they will never get another contract. Eventually, will this become a development dictatorship, a successful one? Maybe, I don't think so. But when will the crisis come? I don't know. What I do know, however, is that this regime has been so successful in eliminating all political parties and social forces, labor unions, trade unions, business associations. They have become so marginalized that if this regime ever wants to negotiate transition, as happened in Chile, for instance, or in Brazil in the 1980s, where big business, political parties, and the military negotiated a transfer of power back to the civilians. The same happened in Turkey in 1983. In Egypt, with whom will the military negotiate? They've left nobody to negotiate with. That, I think, is the most dangerous risk for Egypt's political future. But this may be 10 years down the line, 15 years down the line, maybe even 20 years down the line.